Today we have Ericka Lutz, who is a prolific writer of books, poetry, personal essays. She's short fiction. She's been a magazine editor. She's been a podcast host and producer. She's written a novel. She's taught writing at UC Berkeley and other places. And this last year during the pandemic was quite a prolific poet, including a nomination for a pushcart. So, and the most exciting part is she's also a new board member for us. Yes, so I'm going to turn it over to her. She's going to talk about self-editing techniques to ease your writerly journey. Looking forward to it.
If I could ask everyone who is not going to be speaking to mute themselves. Many of you are already that way, fine, but the rest of you, please, just in case the cat comes in and starts caterwauling, it doesn't disrupt the meeting, okay? I will stay unmuted in case I have to correct some issue for everybody.
Great. Well, I'm really excited about this. Hi, everybody. I see familiar faces and some unfamiliar faces, but as Susan did a pretty good introduction of the various things that I do. Actually, way back when I got my BA in interdisciplinary studies and creative arts. And so that is, even though I've made my living as a writer and as a writing teacher, I've always been really interested in creative process as a whole. So that's where I come, that's kind of where my interest in editing and revision comes from, is as much from creative process as a whole and how you work with that. Doesn't matter what the genre is, whether it's even a writing genre. So today we are talking about self-editing, which can seem a little dry. A lot of times people are not, well, I mean, we do a lot of generative work. We do generative workshops, right? And we also, many of us are involved, we either have writing partners or we're involved in writing groups. And so we know how to give feedback and get feedback on our writing. But a lot of times that whole process of editing ourselves or revising our own work is a little, not as much fun, or a little more problematic. So I'm hoping to ease some of that a little bit today, give you some techniques. I want to talk about, as I think about editing, I actually always have to go back to the first part of it, which is generation. So writing process in general, I want to talk a little bit about that, because how you revise is really dependent on how you write. And then we will discuss revision in both the large and the small, so macro revision and micro revision. And I do have a quick revision exercise. I know that some of you may have brought a page of writing. Any, raise your hand if you brought some writing to work with. Oh, good, wonderful. So yeah, going back, we do get feedback from other people, but while other readers can help us with our work, ultimately we have to become our own best reader. Sometimes our work isn't ready to give to other people. Sometimes the feedback that you get from people is general, not specific. So you know where you need to change something, but not how or what it is. So, so that's what we're going to talk about. Before we do that, though, as I said, I do want to take a step sideways or take a step backwards and talk about the drafting process. Because again, the kind of revisions you need to make often depends on the kind of writer or the kind of writing that you're doing in your first drafts. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, we got this to work before. Let's see if we can do that. There we go. And if you can see here, here's a graphic of the writing process in kind of its idealized form. So you have a brainstorm or a brain dump, and I'm going to talk about the difference between those two. And then there's some organization that generally happens. Listing what you have there, grouping items, prioritizing them, moving to some sort of an outline. So this, again, this is an idealized general view of it. And then from there, supposedly, one gets to a draft. And then you look at your draft and you begin the revision process. So basically what this flowchart is think, organize, write, revise, which makes sense, except it doesn't usually work that way. As you think about your own process, you might find that, well, maybe a lot of this actually happens in your head before you ever get anything down on paper. Or you don't know what you're writing and it ends, you start out on the page. So that's what a brain dump would be, right? And then maybe you're jumping around to somewhere else. So as I've worked with many writers over the years, and I kind of come to believe that there are in reality two kinds of writers for writing first drafts. So I'm going to describe these two categories. Now this exists on a spectrum, but which one, as I read these to you, which one do you think you more closely resemble? First of all, there's the planner. The planner, now this sounds a little like a horoscope. The planner tends to think in a linear fashion. So again, this is pretty general, right? You tend to think, planner thinks in a more linear fashion, and you write starting at the beginning and you go to the end. Planners tend to be slower drafters. A lot of the work is happening in your head. You figure out each sentence or phrase as you go, and you actually finish each thought or paragraph as you write it. You may not even begin writing until you can really see the whole thing in your head. You know what your beginning is. You know what your end is. And you may even have a formal outline, like even if it's for a poem. And a lot of times, poets who work within particular poetic structures tend to fall into this planner category. So that's one type of writer. There's some good parts to being a planner. A lot of your self-editing is actually done in your head and as you write. So you seemingly may have less revision to do when you get to the end. The bad or the hard parts of being a planner is that planners often have trouble stepping outside of their outlines, and creative leaps can seem really scary. And sometimes planners feel like they're just filling in the gaps of what they've already created with that outline. The other kind of writer, and maybe you more resemble this one, is a brain dumper. The brain dumper doesn't necessarily know what they're going to write. They sit down, they may not even know the genre that they're working in. They grab a thread and you go for it, right? You're deep in flow. It's like a soul download. It's a gush. It's a binge. Maybe it really is not just like a binge. Maybe you're, writing for many hours at a time and kind of the raw power of it. It's the story that has to be told. You jumble it out on the page. You may or may not have punctuation. You throw it all out there. you end up with long, rambling pages of stuff. So for the dumper like this, there's some really great parts of it. The writing can take you to some really mysterious and unexpected places. The hard part of this is that you often end up with so much more material that doesn't have any kind of organizational structure. And now you have to negotiate for plot or for structure. And often you have to end up cutting a huge amount. So of course, these two, the planner and the dumper, exist on a spectrum. But if you think about it, where do you fall generally in that? How many people would say that they are a planner? So just raise your hand. Elizabeth is a planner. Naughty is kind of a planner. I see. Yeah, so I see a bunch of planners over here. Yeah. How many of you absolutely say, no, I'm not a planner. I'm a brain dumper. I'm a dumper. I'm raising my hand for the dumper. Actually, I am a brain dumper by nature, although I do exist on that spectrum because I tend to edit my sentences and sometimes paragraphs as I go. So there's a lot of kind of, I don't know, circular type stuff that happens. Right. Well, actually, so I know you're all muted, but if anyone has any, I'd love to hear thoughts on this. So just unmute yourself. Anyone have anything to say about your, yes?
Well, I tend to think it's more of a conglomeration of all of those for me. I mean, it kind of depends partly on what, if I'm writing fiction, there's more planning. If I'm writing poetry, there's none.
So as a fiction writer, you're a planner, and as a poet, you're a dumper.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, because with poetry, it's a flow. It's if I could get the same kind of flow with my fiction, I'd probably be writing better.
Interesting. So I'm hearing a judgment in there.
Well, of course. Everybody does. If there's anyone who's in this room right now who doesn't have some self-judgment on their writing. No.
I'm just about being a planner versus a dumper.
No. That's not it at all. But when I'm in my planning mode, I think I tend to be a little more scattershot in terms of where I'm going to get. I'm doing a lot of research during that period. There is a little bit of brain dumping going on there as well. But my ultimate goal is to get everything sort of lined up as best I can. And so I see that as part of the planning. But I don't do any research or any outright planning when I'm writing poetry. It's like stream of consciousness almost.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Who else has
I have something to say about dumping. Yes.
I
find that when I am doing dump writing, that I will be on a subject and it'll take over, and there be a couple hours or 3 or whatever of this intense exploration of something, and then gradually I can see what I'm really trying to get to, beyond the experience or the description or whatever it is, and it's the aha moment for me at that point where then I can make a structure out of it.
So what you're doing here, you're starting here at that brainstorm, and that actually in the process of brainstorming, that's leading you through the listing and the grouping and the prioritizing towards an outline.
It just somehow gets to an aha point where I'm like, okay, that's what I'm trying to do. And then I have an idea of how to do it because of that.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Yeah. Does somebody else have another comment about this?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think I first started writing more as a planner, and I think that I am a planner, but personally I've learned for me, because I think it's a combination of both. It's better to err as a dumper for me. And then what am trying to learn to do is that then I chase my dumping, and it becomes a process of labeling back to me what it is. And as I label it down, I've learned personally to trust that process more than the plan first, even though that works beautifully too. But for me personally, my best stuff has come when I've put the power of where my idea comes from in more the dumping phase, and then it's my job to articulate it back to me versus the other way. But I'll be finished with this. In a lot of my life, I like to do the exact opposite because I feel I have more control of it. I want to like say it's going to be this and then try to get it down there that way. But the other part works best for me.
I'd like to, I think the dumping works fine, and I do a lot of dumping, and a lot of stuff starts with a dream dump, really, and that works great for short fiction. But I found that I might start with a dump, but when a piece, starts to get into the, tens of thousands of words, that a dump no longer is functional for you. You have to have a plan. Because how the hell are you going to get out of there? I mean, I've got a piece right now that's 22,000 words, and I have a plan to get out, but you have to have that plan when you're out there. And it's great for a 2 or 3 page short story or flash fiction. It's great for poetry. But man, if you're doing a long piece, you need a plan.
Well, so it's interesting because I think, we're all negotiating our way through that idealized list of the order, and so sometimes we jump to, from the brain dump to the outline to find that plan, but then we realize we need to move back to list out actually what's there, et cetera. And then we might jump to revising some of it. So it's not as simple as this, but I think it's sometimes people also, if you're having writer's block, it's important to know that these various steps are happening. They're actually all happening for all of us, whether we're dumping or whether we're planning. It's just the planners are doing it in a lot of this process in their brains, and the dumpers are doing it on the page. A lot of times when people get stuck having block in general, or more specifically with the work, it's because they think they should be planning or planners instead of dumpers rather, or the reverse, right? So if you are getting stuck or frustrated, it might be that you're trying to force yourself into a style that isn't really yours, or you're leaping ahead of yourself in this process, and it's helpful to go back to an earlier step. So, but one way or another, eventually we get to a draft. Okay. And at that point, now it's time to revise. So that's what we really wanted to talk about today. And so we'll move to that. And I think about revision, and the word revision, as we know, is made up of 2 parts, re plus vision. It means literally to see again. So revision is, of course, not just correcting your typos and sending it off to your writing group, right? It really is that process of taking a step back and reevaluating the entire document. So I want to go over the 2 parts of that. The first part is the macro revision. In a perfect world, you let your completed manuscript lie fallow for a while, as long as you can, until you can really see it with fresh eyes. Another thing you can do is if you don't have a lot of time, if you're under deadline, whatever, I have found that it's very helpful to physically change where you are sitting. You change your environment and just, then that helps you look at that document again. But you need to have a time when you can sit down and read it all the way through and ask yourself some big questions. On that read through, it's really tempting to read through with the pen in your hand, and start making corrections as you go. And it's very helpful to avoid that temptation. So what I do is I have a separate sheet of paper, and I do this hard copy if I can. Even if I'm reading on the computer, I take hard copy notes rather than actually start to work on the document. Or if you absolutely don't have paper and pen, at least make notes in the margin. But don't go in and start fixing things, because the whole idea is you want to see things in the large. And you're looking for, answers to the big questions. What's the story? Can you tell yourself what this is about? What is this story or poem or whatever this piece of writing is? Can you tell yourself what it is in one sentence? Have you started in the right place? Most of the time we don't start in the right place. Have you chosen the right point of view? The right, is the plot starting in the right place? Have you, a lot of times people, myself heavily included, there's a lot of early philosophy and musing that goes on. And no, you need to get into the action. Is any of it confusing? Is the pacing right? Where is it boring? Where is it lacking intention? So you're simply taking notes without making these changes and trying to not have the judgment of, oh, this is so boring, I'm a terrible writer, I'm just going to throw this away. Characters, do you have the right number of characters if you're working with characters? Are they changing over the course of the draft? Is there a good balance between action, thought, dialogue, description, explanation? Is the style appropriate? Is the genre appropriate? Is this a poem instead of a short story? Is it a piece of flash fiction or is it a novel? Maybe you thought it was one, but really it's another. This is your time to think big picture about it. And, what about the title? Is the title contributing to the story? So the big picture items are where you probably want to start revising in some ways. And I'm going to actually contradict myself in a moment. But fixing big picture stuff is a really good place to start. And revision, I believe that's where the writing actually happens. That's where the writing happens. It's not in that initial draft, whether you're a planner or a dumper. I'm going to show you. Let's go back to here. I have a sample for you of a couple paragraphs of mine from a short story. Here is the very first draft couple of paragraphs. And then here's the final draft, maybe 13 or 14 drafts later, many months later. The ICU high. As I drove through the range, the hospital, 2 birds flew low across the road and one collided with my windshield. A hard thump of soft flesh and feathers. Its partner flew on. Through the thwap of the windshield wipers, the hills glowed pale green. Fog gathered in streaks in the hills. Inside the hospital, there was no weather, a climate-controlled no place, an airport, a waiting room, a bed on an assembly line, all the raincoats and boots and scarves left in the staff room. As usual, it was good to be there despite the circumstances. I have become a ghoul, haunting hospital hallways and rubbernecking at accidents, addicted to the ICU high. Okay, so very first draft of a short story. It's in first person. We don't know who the first person character is. There's a lot of overwriting. There's my trademark overwrite. Elizabeth is here and she'll recognize I tend to do this. I say the same thing many times in first drafts. An airport, a waiting room, a bed on an assembly line. You know, it's like, choose one, Ericka, you know. And then this kind of philosophical musing, I've become a ghoul. I'm working with theme here already, and it's terrible. It's terrible. So many drafts later of the big picture stuff and some small picture as well. This is the final draft of the same story. First of all, the title has changed. It went from the ICU high to the hand holder. Okay. In the early morning, Eddie drove to the hospital to sit with Wiley Johnson in the ICU. Okay, so already now we have two characters, and it's in third person. A lot of the language that was in that initial draft is still there in that initial image of these two birds flying low, one of them colliding with the car. This is a story, and there's a whole theme about love and partnership, etc. So that's in there. The rain stopped by 8:30, and then all that musing about the description of this hospital and no weather, it just gets cut down to the rain stopped by 8:30. In the hospital staff room, he hung up his coat and stared out into the overcast sky. A shower of white paper fluttered from the Perea Tower. Like walking downtown the day after New Year's, he thought, office workers casting their expired page-a-day calendars out of the skyscraper windows, wafting white paper followed by a woman. It was no graceful swan dive, only a flash against the windows of the tower, something wrong and out of place, a flexing fish. So you have action. Okay, so you no longer have this boring kind of philosophical stuff. You're moving right into action. So much has changed between these two drafts, and that's happened through asking myself those questions. In the process of that, I've actually also worked with the language to make it a little bit stronger. But that's one example of kind of some of the macro changes that can happen over time. So rewriting is happening in the macro, the large scale, when you're slicing and dicing and stretching and squishing your manuscript and maybe changing the format entirely or the genre. Now, the rewriting is happening in the micro when you're honing your prose down to make it more powerful and active. And you would think, okay, I got to do the macro first, but sometimes you need the solutions. You need solutions that you can only find by working with the language itself. In other words, when you're reading through, if you go that example with all that kind of philosophical musings, you know, it makes me as the writer frustrated and feel stuck. So if I work with the writing itself, the language, so that it's no longer feeling so wordy and passive and kind of limp, that'll help drive the story forward in the macro. When you have those passages that feel kind of boring, that's often a signal that you don't know what you're writing about. You're uncertain as a writer. You're ambivalent. You need to dig deeper there. So that can be a really good just clue. So
you don't have to worry.
Oh, I'm sorry. So here are some suggestions for working in the micro. And again, so it's a back and forth thing, just like the process of drafting is, you know, dumping and planning and going back and forth. this revision process is also between the macro, the large stuff, and coming down into the language itself. So some tips for working with the language. Always read your work out loud. Where you're stumbling over it, that's a good clue that the language is not working. I'm a big believer in editing for passive language, and we're going to work on that in a moment, so I'm not going to talk about it yet. A lot of these things you probably are deeply aware of, but it's good to remember. Circling your adjectives and adverbs, because they're not always necessary. Can you pick verbs? Can you pick nouns that do the work instead? Looking at your similes and your metaphors, which are essential. A lot of times, beginning writers use lots of metaphor because they can and because the language is beautiful, but sometimes they pull us out of the story, especially if they don't apply to the story itself. For instance, if you're if the character is a young child, and yet the metaphor that you as the writer are having them think about or use is something that a child wouldn't know about, it's not going to work. So simply marking those metaphors and similes will help you. Cutting unnecessary dialogue. Dialogue tags. We don't hear, they're kind of invisible. Just to say said, it's just invisible. But there are a lot of times when people overuse in early drafts, especially dialogue tags. And I have, I have a wonderful example for you here. Nope, my application. Are you seeing this? These dialogue tags? Okay, this is from one of the Harry Potter books. And J.K. Rowling was just ridiculous with her dialogue tags. So Lupin said quietly, Harry heatedly. Sirius, look, Harry, said Sirius placatingly. Yeah, said Harry, okay. Sirius says quickly. Harry says it in a pained voice. Sirius says affectionately, eagerly, bracingly. It's just a lot. So get rid of them, okay? Just let the actual dialogue tell us that it's in a pained voice. He kept messing up his hair, said Harry. He kept messing up his hair in a pained voice. You know, so this really could have used a lot of editing. Yeah. Cutting filler action. If the phone rings, you don't need to usually say, you know, John picked up the phone. Rather, just move right into the conversation. Examine the length of your sentences and paragraphs. Are they serving you? Have you varied them to the greatest effect? So long sentences provide more information. They tend to have a lyrical feel, right? Short sentences pack punch. So we tend to fall into the same rhythms all the time when we write and when we draft. Da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And it just, you know, then you're lulling yourself to sleep, you're lulling your reader to sleep. So actually looking at the structure of the sentences, the paragraphs too. People tend to fall into either long paragraphs or short paragraphs, but it's the same thing. Long paragraphs are going to provide you that long kind of lyrical feel. So short paragraphs have more impact. Cutting unnecessary explanations. For example, you're in one character's point of view. You don't have to say he saw, he realized, he thought. we know that he's thinking because he's thinking. Same thing if you show, it's this old show versus tell thing. If you show that the reader's a mean person, you don't also need to tell the reader that the character is a mean person. So these are all the things that you're looking for in those reads. And then finally, the very, 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 very last thing you want to do is go through and correct your typos and spelling errors. You don't want to spend too much time with that stuff, because what if you're going back to the macro again and you decide that, you've carefully reworked each little sentence, and then you realize, oh, I don't need that whole paragraph. It can be a little frustrating. So moving back and forth from the macro to micro, it's always finding your own balance. And in terms of correcting typos and spelling errors and finding those things, the most effective way to actually proofread your work, if it's a really important document or you're ready for it to really go out there in the world, anyone know the best way to do it? Any thoughts? You read it backwards. I mean, not literally backwards, but you read one sentence at a time from the bottom up. And the reason you do that is you wrote it, so you know what it's supposed to say, so you cannot see it. You're reading along and you're proofreading, and then all of a sudden you're wrapped up in your story or your poem and you're really excited. You don't see that double word. You can't see it. But if you isolate each sentence by reading it backwards, you can effectively proofread it. My favorite technique for working with both the micro and the macro is actually working with passive language and making it more active. And that's the exercise we're going to do. So first of all, how many of you at some point have heard either you're writing passively or you're not supposed to write passively? Okay, how many of you have some questions about how you identify that, what that actually means? Okay. Yeah, I mean, we're hear that all the time. Oh, don't write passively. You're not supposed to write passively. So for our uses today, and there's a few ways to identify it, but we're going to be working with it's a lot of times it's exemplified by overuse of the verb to be. So is, are, was, were, being, been, you get it. So first of all, what is wrong with the verb to be? Why am I picking on people for using the verb to be? Yeah, you're muted, Erling.
It's not an action verb. It's
Okay.
just it's an in place. It doesn't do anything.
Right, okay,
Yeah.
good. Anybody else?
Not interesting.
Not interested.
Not interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so yes, both and more. But first of all, I do want to say, yeah, and somebody said, Anne said it creates a distance between the narrator and the reader. Yes. So first of all, there's actually nothing wrong with the verb to be. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a perfectly fine verb. It has some very valid uses. It sets scene and it shows continuing action. So for instance, if you have a passage that is like, the sky was red, the streets were quiet in the dawn light, a man was sitting alone on the stoop staring at his shoe, in the bones of the old tree above, a crow was cawing And that's all setting the action, right? That's using lots of the verb to be. We've got was, were, was, lots of verb. Okay, so there it is. There's your scene. And then with a crash, the mountains fell and rumbled, the story began. Right? So you can set the scene using the verb to be and then drive into the story with the action. So that's a really good use of the verb to be. Okay, so nothing wrong with inherently with the verb to be, but overuse of it, all of those things, because the verb to be just lies there. It means, literally, it means to exist. So when you're trying to write persuasively or movingly or all of those things, and your verbs are just kind of lying there, just existing, you're kind of having to work against yourself. It's not interesting, right? English is not, and we could have a discussion about this, but it's not a particularly beautiful language. But the power and the beauty that it does have comes from its verbs, not its nouns. Okay, but we have really interesting verbs. So when you're relying on the same old is, are, was, were, being, been, to be, etc., then you're really missing an opportunity to use some more interesting language. It does absolve the writer and the character, whatever, it absolves you of responsibility. So that old, Nixon was like, mistakes were made. It's like mistakes were made, right? Okay, it has a totally different feeling than if he had said, I made a mistake. So it's much more powerful when you're using verbs other than to be. And it's actually a conciseness tool. If you tend to struggle with conciseness, revising your prose for active language can help, because very often you can find a very wonderful verb like buried next to it. It just tightens things up. So let me show you an example here. Share again. Let's see. Okay, let's see. First of all, where am I? Where did that go? That's not the language all right, here's a an example from me. I was working on a piece looking at a photograph of a grandfather. One of my grandfathers I never knew. He died when my mom was like 5 years old. So I was trying to work with him as a character. And so my description was looking at this photograph of him. Abe's black hair is parted over his right ear and is combed perfectly to the left. Below the comb over is the hint of a widow's peak. I think we tend to think passively because in first draft form, very often we write passively and then we have to edit to make it more active. So if I was going to take that, so we got Abe's black hair is parted, is combed, is the hint of it. So like 3 uses of the of is. So if I change it to Abe parts his black hair over his right ear and combs it perfectly to the left, hiding most of his widow's peak. All of a sudden, it's a lot more, active and interesting. It feels his character. I feel like his character has begun to emerge. He's like deliberate. He's vain. He's mysterious, right? Can you see the difference there? Right. So it's such it's kind of like a cheap and dirty trick you can do with your own writing, just that little trick to tighten it up. So let's try it. So for those of you who brought in a piece of writing, your page, what I want you to do, and maybe you're perfect, you don't have any passive writing, but first thing you do is you just simply go through and circle or mark every instance. You're not going to change them all, but every instance of the verb to be: is, are, was, were, being, been, infinitive, to be. Just circle them and see what you have. And then when you're done, just add them up. And let's see what we have. Anybody have, how many do you have? Who has what? 2? Is that 3 over there? Okay, 3. 10, yay, all right. Good job. 5, okay. So 4, okay. So first of all, most, yeah, Elizabeth, you had 5? Okay. Most totally adequate to great writers, most of us are going to have passive language on a draft. Again, because I think we think passively. And I really strongly encourage you never to try and write actively, because somehow if you're thinking passively, just get it out, you know, and then revise for the active language later. And the idea is you're going to try and revise, but not to get rid of all of the instances of the verb to be. I aim for a 40% reduction. Why 40%? Because it's less than 50%. Okay. And because sometimes it makes no sense to try and change that. It just doesn't make sense. Or it feels too complicated, or it messes with your rhythm, or you just don't want to, or, you know, you just want to leave it alone. So what you do is you're going to examine each example. Figure out, sometimes the verb is hiding right next to it. Like dinner is eaten at 8 might become we dine at 8, right? Or there was rain falling, rain fell. See how it can get much shorter, right? So why don't you take a moment and take just a couple of them and see if you can tweak yours. And then we'll see if we have an example that you can share. Nope, 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 not that. That's not what I want. Try that again.
Can you speak to the word had? He had.
Yeah, that's
Yes,
another
ma'am.
kind of, what do you think about had?
Well, I find that I tend to use it quite a bit, and it does end up feeling somewhat passive. But then there's, it's like he had just entered the house when. It's like,
Right.
how do you, I recognize that there's some passivity in there, but it's also, a statement of what preceded the coming action.
Right. So again, I agree with you because sometimes you need it for kind of tense understanding of time. So that's why I suggest that all of these things, you're not trying to fix all of them. You're going for 40%. And if you get to one where you don't think it should be changed for whatever reason, leave it. But even a 40% reduction really tightens things up, and you'll like it. You'll like it. I think you'll like it. Here is that same passage that I had just before here. Okay. And what I find is when I start working on the passive language, it is an entryway for me into the sentence, so that I end up now at that point editing for more tightness, to make it more concise. I'm getting rid of all my double and triple descriptions of everything. I'm fixing it. I'm making it better, but by going in through the passive writing, it feels less overwhelming to me. So that's why I use it as such a strong exercise for myself. This particular passage I ended up not using whatsoever because in working with it deeply, I actually discovered that I didn't know what the heck I was trying to say with this character. And I was just wandering off and I needed to do more work. And that's kind of interesting too, because sometimes you find out, this writing sucks. I need to go somewhere else with it. So. Okay, so anybody have any anything else to say on that? Yes, go ahead. You're
muted. You're muted.
Still muted. Okay,
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Priscilla, maybe you could write it in the chat.
Yeah, toss it in the chat. Did any of you, so I guess some of you had a lot. Did you change a couple? Did you have questions about it? Is this useful?
Oh, very much.
Okay, good. The only, and I know we're finishing up, but the other thing that I promised to talk about, and I only have a couple things to say very briefly, is the question of how do you know when to stop editing? And I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to that. I know that Joyce Carol Oates, who writes a gazillion books all the time, a friend of mine went to a reading of hers and she was up there, and even while being introduced, she was looking at her published book and making changes in the published book before she got up to read. So for Joyce Carol Oates, you never stop editing. My grandmother was the author Tilly Olson, and it's actually it's been a bit of a problem because as we tried to get her readings, recently a number of her readings were produced on Audible, but we couldn't use her reading her own work because every time she would do a public reading, she would change things. She would be reading from the book, but she changed them. Or if you went to go hear her read and then got a book signed by her, she'd probably sit and talk with you for a while the line grew. And then she would spend time with you writing in your book, but then correcting things that she had decided really should be changed. And for Audible, the text has to be the same as the printed text has to be the same as the one that's read. So we actually had to get an actress to read her work rather than have her the recordings of her work published. So for me, I generally start submitting my work when I and my trusted readers feel like completely done and exhausted by the whole process. But I don't necessarily feel like it's done until it's published, because usually, as you know, in the publication process, there's editorial that happens. But I don't know when you stop editing. So that's just something to think about. Anyway, any questions about any of this, or any other thoughts about revising, etc.?
There's a comment in the chat. I have the opposite problem. Once I've written something, I struggle with finding other ways to say it. So, Christopher.
Well, maybe, you mean in terms of it's coming out perfectly for you?
I'm reading it from the chat. So I don't know.
Right. Well, I mean, it's coming out well enough to where I feel like I'm conveying the idea. And I'm like, well, anyone could read that and they'd understand it. But it doesn't mean that it's necessarily captivating. It might just mean, it just might be dry, almost instructional like type writing. But no, I mean, there's no times that I read something that I've written and think, oh, that's perfect, or that's amazing. It's sort of like when you were talking about at the beginning, the different writers, like the planners and the brain dumpers. I find that I'm very good at brain dumping lists, or I'm very good at brain dumping an outline. And so
you're a planner. That's a plan. That is a symptom of a planner. And I think what I said is a lot of times planners have difficulty enhancing the outline, you
Right.
know, sort of like, so that is a challenge. And so I guess the challenge there is to become more of a dumper. And where if you're reading your own work and thinking, well, this is feeling a little dry and instructional, that generally means it's an opportunity right there to go deeper, and maybe to, you know, set it aside, but do a writing exercise about that particular moment or sentence or paragraph, and see how much you can say about it from another angle without messing with that. But that is usually an opportunity to just kind of dig a little deeper, I think.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And that's the struggle, because I'll see something I've written, and yeah, it's almost like writer's block with regards to digging deeper. But I like the idea of taking just one sentence or something, and maybe even just one word out of that sentence, and trying to expand on that, or make a mind map from that, or I don't know, some way to get my creative juices going.
And play with it. I mean, it's a matter of playing with it, but by not messing with that document itself, by having it be a separate document, then you're not afraid to, I think there's less fear of like destroying that or changing that too much. Move it aside and start with something else, but using that as a thread. There's a poetry writing exercise that I've done a number of times, where you take a poem you've written and you now double space it, and for each line there, you make sure to write another line underneath that and see what happens. So you're just thickening it out, and that's another way in. But it can also help that time period of like stepping aside as much of a pause as you can give the work, and then coming back to it with a fresh brain, and, you know, a different hat, not your writer's hat, but your editor's hat. That can also help. Yes.
Well, I do a very interesting thing once in a while when I'm stuck where I think a line is weak, but I just can't seem to get there. I try to rewrite it from the point of view of a character that's not even in the book. And sometimes I'll do it as absurd as possible. What would Dolly say? What would Mickey Mouse say? What would Rambo say? Just absolute absurdities, in order to sort of, like you're saying, sort of shake the tree a little bit and see what pops out if someone else is saying this. Because I think that that way you're not, yeah, because dialogue is my hardest thing to tackle. I always have trouble with dialogue. And so one of the things I find is that by doing that exercise with it, I end up getting stuff that would have never occurred to me at all with the characters that I'm working with. So it's just a one
I
way to
like
do
it. I like that a lot. That sounds like really fun. Just take as, because it's taking just like a sideways approach. And anytime you can like step aside from what you think you're doing and looking at from a different angle, you're going to get something interesting. And maybe it's useful and maybe it's not, but it might be fantastic.
So Ann Keck, you need to unmute.
Yes, thank you. My writing, I am often criticized that I don't show enough emotion. And so I was thinking what Christopher said, that it sounds kind of dry, and that I think is something that I have to work on. And what I've been starting to use is the emotional thesaurus. I don't know if that's coming out backwards. I see Nona uses it. And so when I have a place where I think that the character needs to show emotion but is not doing it, I pull out, yep, there we go. This has been really helpful in order to do the, it's a showing, not telling. So it describes how your body reactions are when you're angry or surprised, and you can show what the character is feeling, their emotional response, rather than just saying they're angry or surprised. So I just wanted to put that in, and perhaps if Christopher hadn't heard about that, I think this is a really good guide to use.
I love
Yeah,
it. So, and Anne, you said that you had on one page, you had 10 uses of the verb to be.
So it was all scene setting though, right? So I was looking at it.
Again, right?
It's coming in. So there's a
all
lot of
level stuff. So if you take those and you make them action verbs, or 40% of them, you're gonna get down into, and there's gonna be more emotion. So that's another approach.
And even while we've been talking, I've already gotten rid of 3 of them.
Excellent.
So I only have 1 more to go.
Right, there you go. Right. Yeah.